So welcome to the podcast Exiled Lives with Ece Pazarbaşı. She's here to give a workshop with the title Opportunities in Exile, Fundings and Cooperations to Get Started, which really came together as a collaboration with the Performing Arts program, PAP Berlin, who have been kind also to support this. Now, I just wonder, when you give workshops, what are kind of the main issues that always come back from your participants?
First of all, I would like to thank you so much for your invitation. It's so nice to be here, and it's great to have the opportunity to share the knowledge and get people empowered. Most of the time, the situations that I come across with is the artists or the curators or the NGOs, they feel like they're lost in the funding scene. And this could be in different levels. It could be they don't know where to apply to or where to search funding for. But it can also be they simply don't know how to formulate their applications for submitting. I have so many artists coming and saying, hey, I think my work is great. I think I'm doing it right in the applications, but I don't get it why I don't get the funding from.
Yeah. Are there also any issues that you also learned yourself by doing the workshops? Things that you also kind of maybe changed in your approach, or things that you feel like, okay, I have to focus more on this actually, because that's a very common problem that, and I know now exactly how to help people. Is there something like that?
I mean, I constructed the whole entire workshop depending on my experience and my own practice.
Yeah.
The most important point in writing an application, and the mistake that I see is, and which is so normal, that the artists, when they're writing their applications, they're so much lost in the concept. So much lost in the concept, but you don't understand what exactly the project is about. So I'm trying, and I'm also giving them tools, very practical tools, to how to differentiate these two. And when they apply these tools, it's obvious that they have a clear, easy to understand project description.
So it's also to give them more analytical skills, or how to break it into different parts, and
exactly.
That's what you do probably. Okay, nice.
That's why we call it Operation Workshop.
Operation Workshop.
Because it's the clinic.
It's a clinic. And hopefully people get better also after that. What are the responses? Do you get also thank yous and people who kind of get started in the end? And
I have tremendous amount of thank yous afterwards. The workshop has taken place. It's because the workshop is also empowering. People feel like, now I know that I am something and I can do something, and I'm like, of course. I'm just giving them the tools.
Okay, then I really wish you the best with keep giving the tools to the people who need them. And thank you so much for talking about it.
Thank you.
Thank you. The talk that I will be giving today, kind of coming from a process of trying to bring everything together that I did in the last 2.5 years. If you want to read about it, there is going to be a text in red thread. It's going to be in Turkish online, and there is already another version of this text at the ITI journal, the 3rd issue, which is just published this week, in German and in English. What my talk may inspire too is a need, I think, for a more pluralistic perspective on theatre history and its archives. since it is also a shared history between Turkey and Europe. There have been initiatives in the past to document theater by Turkish migrants, like very briefly also in the Schaubühne in Berlin and the archives of the independent performing arts, which is an initiative to decentralize the architecture of the archives in order to respond to more local developments in the independent scene. In recent years, structures and networks for exilic artists have been developing out of a global need. I will give a brief summary about those mechanisms, but it is important to note that if we are talking about the memory of modern Turkey's theatre and the development of new archives, we should have that transnational perspective that operates beyond national borders. We should also not forget Germany and Turkish societies are interconnected, which binds them in memory, solidarity and politics. The history of exile is also then an opportunity to reflect on these interconnections. So the title, Exiled Lives on the Stage, Geographies of Migrant Experience and Aesthetic Self-Fashioning, they refer to theory from Edward Said, who also wrote on exile a lot, and the self-fashioning is a term that I picked up from Jana Meerson's book on exile. I recently gave a similar talk in Istanbul at the Atatürk Library, so that's maybe interesting. And this is where I start with a quote from Edward Said, who wrote that to see a poet in exile, as opposed to reading the poetry of exile, is to see exile's antinomies embodied and endured with a unique intensity, end of quote. Now in my project, I take this to heart when I interview theater artists and cultural workers from Turkey, some of them are here today, who have recently left their home country and settled in Germany. But I also looked at the UK, specifically London, and they settled there for various reasons, but often with a sense of urgency. And we also talked about it today in the workshop with Neslihan Arol. Now, in these interviews, I recognize a similar burning intensity as Said wrote about his friends, of a terminal loss, but also hope. And I hope that is also what this talk can transpire. Through interviews, panel debates, and a podcast, Exiled Lives, I too seek to map these territories of experience, as Said calls it, these geographies of migrant experience that bind Turkey with Europe, beyond, and this is a quote again, those mapped by the literature of exile itself. An important question that I ask in this presentation, and what we have also discussed in the panels, is to what extent the newly fashioned identity of artists from Turkey and in Europe stems from a sense of experience of self-exile, working through the trauma of having to leave and arrive in a new place, or from an outside case, perhaps even, and sorry for that, an imperialistic case or a self-fetishizing case with regard to the industry and the art policy system. Then, the question of exile, it comes up almost every time. When I talk about exile with the interviewees, the first remark is, I am not an exile. It's actually quite common, and I also see the term exile rather as a question. It's not something that I want to label anybody into. But gradually when we talk, it seems that people kind of feel affinity to it. Not maybe exile, sometimes self-exile, as it is a voluntary movement still. So that happens a lot. So I take the term as a stepping stone for discussing issues of displacement and uprootedness that many are going through when making the decision to move from their homeland to make a new life abroad. In my discussions with artists, I often get the remark of, I am not an exile. They usually mean they are not as bad off as the incoming political refugees from Syria or now from Ukraine. Exile does not have to be a consequence of forced migration only. It can be a state of mind that filters everyday experiences due to external circumstance. Cultural theorists have described the exilic position as a dual perspective, or a consciousness as constitutive of the exilic experience. The exile is often defined as a subject position between at least two languages and or places in terms of a perpetual becoming and a multiple belonging. The exilic experience is also commonly defined as being home away from home, bearing a double consciousness and a perspective on the home and the receiving country or city while illuminating the exilic own subjectivity. Cultural theorists have then also described, and at times I have to say romanticized, the exiled as a cultural hybrid or a cosmopolitan citizen of the world, and as a special position for reflection on political developments and altering value systems. While their precarity and vulnerability can also raise awareness to these systems when they reach the public sphere, to which also I think my project and also this talk may contribute. In my own podcast, Exiled Lives, I asked theatre actor and director Mehmet Ali Alabora if he relates to the term, as he is actually legitimately an exile who fled from Turkey in 2013 after the Gezi Park protests. Particularly the lynch campaign in Turkish conservative media, which was targeting him personally, as well as some cast members of his production, which was called Mimineur, in 2012, for alleged similarities with the Gezi Park uprising, but also the subsequent Gezi Park trial that concluded in April last year, with a life sentence for Osman Kavala without possibility of parole, caused him enough reason to switch Turkey for Wales. And yet, in all of our conversations, he did not refer to his current life situation as necessarily in exile. He had already made the decision to leave before. The slander campaign in mainstream media made the process only quicker and naturally more traumatic. Wales was just an accidental choice, but it feels now like a second home. In his answer about his exilic status in my podcast, he reminds me of Turkey's own history of migration, which reveals easily around every racket table. And he says, exile is almost engraved in our DNA. Exile does not only affect the exiled, it also affects the lineage too. In the case of his own family, which includes a long line of artists based in Istanbul but originally coming from Thessaloniki, he reminds of how cities are made by the people and their anecdotes. Quote, he says, I left Istanbul in 2013, so the Alaboras could only survive for 103 years. And that was actually kind of a joke, and it's also part of his style to kind of joke about these situations. But in a good way, in a hopeful way, I think, in a positive way. All of this makes him relate to exile as rather a mindset than a condition, for which he quotes Henry Pachter's words, who was also an exile of the an intellectual of the Nazi regime, and who ended up in New York, just like Hannah Arendt. Quote, being in exile is not a matter of needing a passport, it is a state of mind. I discovered this, but gradually. In the beginning, I did not experience exile as a universal mode of existence. End of quote. Pachter stated this in his belief back then that his situation would be only temporary, as Hitler was seen as a transient and an extraordinary phenomenon that philosophically had no place or no right to exist. He would soon find out that this idea would make him even more isolated. Alabora explains in the panel then that I organized in Berlin last September that he has no such illusions of going back like Pachter, but the idea of exile or feeling exiled came rather to him from outside, when a journalist asked him about it. And although he obviously was in exile, he sees himself not as exiled. But of course, he says, it is multi-layered, and it kind of changes from day to day. There are moments when you really feel like you're in exile, but generally I'm not a person, so I'm more of a person who likes to look forward, he says. Of course, Alabora's situation is a particular one, more high profile than some of the others who were implicated by the Gezi trials, like some of the cultural workers of Anadolu Culture. Some of them I also interviewed in Berlin and in London. Yet many more have left without imminent risk. Actually, most artists that I interviewed were not in danger politically, but there are many different reasons for why someone feels exiled or in self-exile from their country. After the Berlin panel, a queer person from Turkey came up to me and thanked me and said, this is my story too. I realize I am actually in self-exile in my mind. He tells me about his difficulties in Turkey, common to LGBTs, his half Kurdish side of the family, and how singing in choirs in Berlin has helped him tremendously. The psychological pressures come often in my interviews, yet the reasons for leaving are very diverse. The difference with previous migration waves is that we are seeing a complexity today of layers of political, economic, social, and psychological reasons, all interweaving to different degrees. Actually, right now, at the moment, quite topical, quite sexy even to talk about exile, I have to say, sadly enough maybe, but it is back on the map, especially with the rise of authoritarian regimes and populist movements in countries like Hungary, Poland, social and political crisis such as in Iran and the war in Ukraine, of course, which is also causing Russian artists and journalists to move from their home countries. In the German theater, we have seen last year the production Exile, which was based on a novel by Leon Feuchtwanger, by my compatriot Belgian director Luc Perceval at the Berliner Ensemble, where they also had a Ukrainian dramatist, Pavlo Arie, who was the dramaturg-in-chief of the left bank theaters in Kiev before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and he curated a cultural salon called Stories from Exile. Also inspired from a need to accommodate Ukrainian artists, 2022 saw the start of the Goethe Institute im Exil project in collaboration with Akut Theater, which is also becoming a platform now for Iranian artists these months. Prior to the Ukrainian urgency, the Exile Ensemble was founded in 2016 at the Gorky Theater with exiles from Syria, Palestine, and Afghanistan. But I don't think there is much activity going on right now there. All the while, a silent exodus of artists from Turkey had been set in motion ever since the backlash of the Gezi Park protests in 2013, which incited Alabora and some of his crew members to move, and increasingly so after the failed coup attempt in 2016 and the ongoing economic and financial crisis since 2018. By looking at the theater works of new wave, so-called new wave artists from Turkey and Germany and the UK, we do not only discover similarities in what I call the exilic performative between different national contexts, but we can also add new cultural perspectives to the study and archives of exile in general. And that's also why I invited people who are activists and documentary makers who are working on archives today to discuss in the panel after my talk. What interests me particularly is how exilic theater can be a compass for our current democratic institutions and the political configurations we live by today. But the latest migration wave is not unique in the history of modern Turkey, nor in its migration histories. When it comes to the German perspective, the modern migration history that also affects Turkish theater history starts with the bilateral guest worker recruitment agreement with the then BDR. Oh, sorry, this was another slide. Okay. West Germany, Bundesrepublik Deutschland, mostly for manufacturing in 1961, which sparked the first wave of migrants from Turkey. Germany-Turkey military, industrial and trade relations date actually already back to the 18th century, starting from the declaration of peace and friendship between the Kingdom of Prussia and the Ottoman Empire in 1790, which helped migration of German artists and officials to mostly Istanbul up to the First World War. Since 1933, Ankara and Istanbul also received a second wave of immigrants from Germany, especially Jewish academics and experts fleeing Nazi Germany, who were welcomed in Turkish universities, conservatories, ministries, to help build the newly established republic. Interesting enough, Erol Boran uses in his book Die Geschichte des türkisch-deutschen Theaters und Kabaretts, based on his PhD, only 5 times the word exile. Since the beginning of theater in Turkish in Germany starts for him with the guest workers in the 1960s, which were not seen as being in exile per se. The history starts for him with the theater projects at the Studiobühne Stuttgart by Ece Pazarbaşı, who arrived in Germany even before the first guest workers in 1958. But it's rather the theater movements of the 70s, mostly defined by Meray Ülgen and the Berlin Oyuncuları since 1976, which would become the center of Turkish-German theater, that would incorporate and show solidarity with the political asylum seekers from Turkey after the military coup of September 1980. In that year, 60,000 refugees from Turkey would seek political asylum in Germany. Central to the establishment of that ensemble was an earlier initiative, the Volkshaus Arbeidstheater, Halk Evi İşçi Tiyatrosu, that would include a lot of those Turkish intellectuals and actors in forced exile and stage a series of politically motivated productions inspired by agitprop tradition. That group would continue to exist until the early 1990s, before it would split and lead to the foundation of the now amateur theater, I have to say, Ashnan Teatro Tololulu, which is still active today. At the moment, they have a play at Teatr 28 entitled Gulitsa Park, about a mother whose son dies in a Turkish prison, upon which she flees to Berlin. A most influential figure, and I think this is something I would like to stress, is since the 1980s is Vasif Öngören. It's worth mentioning his name, I think, especially because he stands for a type of theater that I believe could be interesting to see what's happening today. So he would start the Birlik Tiyatrosu, the Collectief Theater, in 1980, which was actually earlier founded in 66 in Ankara. It's Emine Sevgi Özdemir, if you know her, who is a Turkish-German author, poet, theater actress also, and a playwright. She describes him anonymously in her novel Die Brücke van Goldenen Hoorn as an artist and a communist. He and his wife, she says in her book, had played theater in Turkey. They were then invited by a theater festival. That's how they came to Germany, played their production, and stayed in Germany. He would go in the day to the German theater to look at rehearsals. That theater was called the Berliner Ensemble. Okay, sounds nice. He came in 1962 to Berlin to study actually theater studies, but he ended up, due to his interest in Brecht's epic theater, in the Berliner Ensemble, learning from Erwin Pescator and Helene Weigel themselves. Öngören's Birlik Tiyatrosu in Ankara, maybe you know, was forbidden after the military coup of March 1971, and he and some of his collaborators landed in prison. He would be released under the General Amnesty of 1974, and although he started his theater activities under Birlik Tiyatrosu again, together with his partner and actress Meral Taygun, now in Istanbul, he and Meral were forced to move again to Germany after a bomb attack on the theater, while rehearsing Nazım Hikmet's Memlekettimden İnsan Manzarları in 1977. It was a play that have even significance today. Vasif Öngören would become a leading figure in the intercultural theater scene, both in Germany and even in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, the cultural ministry would invite him and Meral to give theater courses for 2 years to migrants in the Dutch program STIPT, that's the Foundation Intercultural Projects in the Field of Theater, funded by the Dutch Ministry of Health, Wellbeing and Sports in 1981. From their communist and Brechtian epic theater background, Öngören and Tayfun would advocate for a theater as an alternative model of reality, but they also strongly advised their workshop participants to integrate in the Dutch culture. This is actually a strong idea that still exists today in the Turkish-German theater scene, although the post-migrant perspective has clearly broken with that, like Shermin Langhoff's battle cry, disintegreert euch, which she borrowed from the anti-Semitic researcher Max Zolek's book, as an open attack on the leading white dominant culture. It's not my intention here to summarize the whole history of migrant and post-migrant theater in Germany or elsewhere. For the German history or the story, it suffices to say that Öngören and Taygun belonged to a group of influential artists who went into self-exile and who would shape the memory of modern Turkish theater abroad, while inspiring the already existing diaspora to develop their own theaters. Now, exile studies have often focused on those exilic subjects, initially the German Jewish diaspora, emigres who escaped Nazi-fascist persecutions in the 1930s, who were famous enough to make it abroad, like names that you know already, maybe Hannah Arendt, Bertolt Brecht, Theodor Adorno, Albert Camus, Jacques Derrida, Edward Said, to name a few. In his 1968 Polish exile, Zygmunt Bauman defined the exilic subject position as a contentious point to critique national state borders and the dangers of totalitarianism. Hannah Arendt felt even compelled to state in her own US exile in the 1930s, quote, "Refugees from every nation, driven as they are from country to country, have become the avant-garde of their own people." I think this is a very striking sentence. Exiled people, refugees, they become the avant-garde of their own people. But even for all his fame and avant-garde status, someone like Vasif Öngören would have very much difficulty finding foot in the theater institutions in the 1980s. What is important here to remember is that he and others did help to develop today's infrastructure in Berlin. I know it's a failing infrastructure, it has many, many problems, but it's because of him and others that it actually is here. Which, under the current post-migrant discourse of the 2010s, has offered pockets of support and refuge for different generations. This brings me to the institutional question and the infrastructure that we have today due to recent policy changes in Germany's but also Europe's diverse cultural industry. Not everyone who makes the jump to Europe makes it. Already in the 1930s, Pachter was quite cynical of the uprooting effects that exile has on the artist or the poet. Only the world-famous ones make it, but more often than not, exile destroys talent, or it means the loss of the environment that nourished the talent morally, socially, and physically. I came across many artists who are struggling to enter the institutional and support frameworks to continue their artistic labor as before. I therefore wrote a policy report on support networks, programs, and institutions in Germany that artists from Turkey, particularly those based in Berlin, have used in recent years in order to make the information more available, but also reveal the differences. Germany is also quite differently organized in state support than, for instance, the UK. So if you are interested, this report is freely available from the website exiledlives.eu. If you go to outputs, then I think the first link will be the report. It's of course an open process. If you want to react to it, it's always nice to hear comments and to improve it. Now in Berlin, a common phrase, "Go to Gorki," is told to newcomers, as if the Maxim Gorki Theater, known for being a post-migrant center in the last decade, can address all the problems of all migrant generations, including the Turkish ones. Their support for Turkey's exiles has been mostly centered around the ostracized journalist Can Dündar, Kurdish artist Sera Doğan, and author Aslı Erdoğan. Barış Atay, although not in exile, also staged his Sadece Diktatör, Just a Dictator. Thereafter it got banned in Istanbul in 2018. The post-migrant discourse of the last 20 years, to which artistic director Shemin Langhoff was a vocal advocate, has certainly exposed white German privilege in the cultural infrastructure, enabling artists of color, including artists with Turkish and Kurdish backgrounds, to make art and theater professionally at Germany's institutional center. But migrant theater in Turkish or bilingual, and I'm thinking of places like Teatrum or Teatro 28, has suffered and, despite the infrastructure, largely remains in the periphery still today. The relevant German support systems, and we talked about that also yesterday in the panel, like Berlin Senatswelt, often as Berlin, Academic Exiles, Fixing What's Broken. There's a big poster there at the back of the room. There's Artists at Risk, AR, 8A. There's Penn's Writers in Exile, the Allianz Kulturstiftung, or the IFA and Goethe Institute's joint Martin Roth initiative are not nearly sufficient. Most often they are awarded on the basis of quality output rather than process, and usually also for just a very short amount of time. I do have to say I saw a little bit of improvement in the Fonds Darstellende Kunsten, where there is now a little bit more focus on process. It's a beginning, but yeah, this has to be the kind of the COVID-19 effect, that people feel like we need more time. And funding is often not addressing the very needs of social and professional integration, like just learning German, for instance. The very stratified organization of German state support also often creates the idea that artists have to claim their exilic identity in order to be valued in a system that ticks boxes, a form of self-orientalization of artistic labor, which the post-migrant scene had already critiqued, but still lingers on in a deeply racially embedded and unequally organized society. I have to say it how it is. In the UK, there are little or no support programs for individual displaced artists like we have in Germany. Support is mostly tied already to the institutions through the Arts Council, which makes artistic labor largely dependent on collaboration with institutions like the Arcola Theatre in Dalston Hackney, where I also was based for a month, or community-based donor and sponsorship. And there are like centers for that, like the Alevi Center, for instance. There are a few who organize it themselves. In London, multiculturalism has also advanced differently than in Berlin, with a longer history of colonialism as much as its capitalist modes of artistic labor and cultural industry. I met many theater artists from Turkey, including Kurds, who arrived in recent years and are self-organizing theater initiatives with the help of community centers like Deymar, for instance, or the Halk Evi of the Alevi communities. In a panel that I organized at the Arcola, it became clear that although co-founded by Turkish Mehmet Ergen in 2000, in the part of East London that is the hub of Turkish and Kurdish migrants, the Arcola Theatre largely lacks the resources to support newcomers. Arcola defines itself as a British off-West theatre that stages high-quality productions, and of course there's nothing wrong with that, but it creates kind of different expectations for the community and for what kind of resources there are for them. Its participative a la Turca program has indeed helped artists, Turks and Kurds alike, in the margins of its activity, and it's produced professionals like actress and director Barış Çelioğlu, who established herself in the London off-scene with her own theatre East End Bull. Unfortunately, most of these initiatives are on a shared profit basis, which in reality replicates a self-exploitative system where actors are in it for their own enjoyment, commitment, self-care, some maybe for therapy, but not necessarily for pay. Cities and metropoles have become more important too over the years in affecting domestic policy, but also in the management of the greater influx of people since the refugee crisis. However, it is interesting to understand that cities have the capacity to welcome exiled and self-exiled, but as such, and we also speak, for instance, of Berlin as the city of exiles. That's a very common phrase already for some decades, basically, but it's only getting more in the picture now. But cities do not really deal with exile as a category. And now Alexis Moos, he says, or he points that there is an historical paradox, as cities are much the work of exiles, though, quote, the urban order must erase any trace of exile to ensure its vocation, based on principles of permanence, durability, and immutability, a stasis that shares its dogma with the state, end of quote. This self-claimed durability on the part of the city stands in contrast to what I call, after Carola Tizet, the permanent temporariness of many of its temporary residents. Tizet critiques the German policy starting with the Gastarbeiter between 55 and 73, and particularly confirmed after the fall of the Berlin Wall with what she calls Kettenduldung, or chain tolerance, stemming from a need to control the influx of foreigners to secure the German identity and social unity. Kettenduldung refers then to those whose toleration status is particularly insecure, long-lasting, or has no end in sight, but whose repeated approvals of short-term permission to stay adds another link to the toleration chain. And it's of no surprise that this actually also very much coincides with a kind of financial precarity. So in this capitalist system, so it's also to do with temp jobs, of course, which only gets worse when you are in an exilic situation. With the memory of the 1930s and Turkey's present state of politics, despite or maybe in spite of Germany's long-lasting history of relations, one can understand how Germans are welcoming now a new diaspora of white-collar Turks, and within that also Kurds, though treated differently, I would say, as a permanent temporariness to appear in their civic landscape, for which German Turks have been advocating the infrastructure. And I'm also thinking here of, again, Academy of Exile, for instance, who brought to life, after the witch hunt in the Turkish institutions, after the emergency law situation, to respond to an immediate need, and that was specifically for the barış için akademisyenler, the peace academics. So there is kind of an infrastructure, and there is a know-how from the German Turks in solidarity with Turkish and Kurdish people who are coming over. But it also serves Germany's image as a tolerant country at the political center of the European Union. But within that policy climate, migrant artists have often been instrumentalized, fetishized, or led even to a self-fashioning, and thereby domestication in their struggle to end their permanent becoming in that chain tolerance, both as tokens of citizenship and as artistic laborers who are dealing with racial inequality and the glass ceiling on a daily basis. Now, let's turn for the final part, and I take my final cue from Jana Meerson's proposition towards what she calls the exilic performative. Quote, I don't have that on the slide, so listen carefully. I believe, she says, that the poetics of exile, the quotidian and professional art of self-fashioning and survival, is always grounded within the artist's social, economic, and personal exilic conditions. It is the process of constant negotiation and translation, she says. particularly this idea of self-fashioning interests me, as the artist in self-exile is also naturally forced to redefine their subject position as an artist in creative terms. A lot of artists speak of a newly found professionalization, an artist identity, but they also report to me about the demand for having to talk only about migrant or Turkey-related topics. The practice, however, demonstrates a variety of functions. Among them, oh yeah, they're already up there. One, and of course this is not an exhaustive list, this is my own interpretation, and I'm trying to kind of bring a couple of things together. One is the demand to offer theatre in Turkish to keep a sense of community through language. And usually, and this is maybe because this is something that they share with migrant theatre, of course, but they usually also play with language between the different cultures. So there's also already some sort of lost in translation situation there. Two, the urge to extend the cultural memory and commemoration of recent events, which also happens through putting the canon, for instance, in a new dramaturgical context. Three, the need for working through personal and or communal trauma after the exilic moment, and that could maybe lead to some sense of healing. And four, a chance to speak truth to power and maybe even circumvent censorship on sensitive social issues. The last function I, for instance, see in the production We Are Arrested at the Royal Shakespeare Company's Mischief Festival in Stratford-upon-Avon in 2018, but also in Barış Atay's Sadece Diktatör, which I already mentioned. Both address the audience in a direct way, breaking the fourth wall in order to cause a reaction of solidarity in the audience.
Everything that had happened to him up until that point, how he arrived in prison, and then what the quality of the experience was like. So we jump around in the story a lot in terms of places, locations and timelines. So we had to find a language where we could hop between these places. And so we worked with Ingrid, youth movement, in a way that you're able to take the audience on that journey really clearly without showing everything literally.
Movement is used quite a lot in We Are Arrested, actually, and that's the beauty of it, is that there's so much more than you would imagine at first. A lot of the conversations we had was making sure that the movement really drives the storytelling, and I feel that through a lot of subtlety, we have created a piece that has lots of flow and structure.
It is told a lot in the first person.
So, in We Are Arrested by the exiled Berlin-based Turkish journalist Can Dündar, titled after his final tweet from the courtroom before his imprisonment, we hear Can's inner thoughts, and he says, "I ask myself if I'm afraid, but I know that fear breeds silence, and we have a responsibility to speak out before silence takes hold." Can Dündar was arrested in November 2015 and later sent to prison for publishing footage of weapons being sent by Turkish intelligence services to rebel fighters in Syria. The play was adapted by Pippa Hill and Sophie Iwats, which you also see there in the video, from Dündar's memoir under the same title, We Are Arrested. The play explores exile from the space of a prison cell. Besides speaking truth to power, the play did also add to a self-fashioning, I have to say, of Can Dündar's persona as a freedom fighter. Yet it also celebrated the power of words and the struggle for freedom of speech. Or, as we hear Can Dündar musing in his prison cell, quote, "My mind is made up. I will transform this dungeon into a microphone, make my voice heard as far as it will reach." Maybe more interesting, the first function, namely the play with language, which produces a sense of community, I recognize in productions like Seyar Compania's Migrant Shakespeare, produced for the Edinburgh Fringe Festival in 2021, and Duruşma, the trial at the Arcola, which is based on Kafka's trial, both directed by Nasieni, though these performances did obviously more than just playing with language. Migrant Shakespeare turned different characters from Shakespeare's plays into migrants. Hamlet is a meatpacker, King Lear a construction worker, Caliban a hotel cleaner, Lady Macbeth a housewife looking after children, Shylock washes dishes in a restaurant, and Prospero sits in a wholesale warehouse, fulfilling all of our delivery demands. Although neither the director nor most of the actors are in self-exile, the ensemble has been taking in a lot of the Turkish and Kurdish actors, and who have seen no chances to do their profession in Turkey, so trying their luck in the UK. Yeah, sorry.
To die. To sleep. To sleep portends to dream. Away.
Now, goods, stand up for bastards.
Aşılıyor tüylavno Züromen adırvan By his good head and strong And his thunder shone By his good head and strong And his thunder shone Hey nonni, hey nonni Hey nonni, hey nonni Hey nonni, hey nonni, nonni Hey nonni, hey nonni
Let's watch your film.
Fed with the same food. Arab with the same weapons. Subject to the same thesis.
Thy husband is thy lord, thy wife, thy keeper.
Here I stand your slave, a poor, strong, weak, and despised old man.
Let's move on to Istanbul. So the second function of theatre, extending memory, often in covert dramaturgical ways, we can see in Istanbul and Ban Productions' adaptation of Death and the Maiden, Olum Vekis, by Chilean playwright Ariel Dorfman, directed by Barış Çileoğlu. This originally 1990 play set in a place that is probably Chile, but it could be actually any country, including maybe even Turkey, which goes through the changes from a dictatorship into a democracy. Maybe for Turkey it's the opposite, but the play deliberately deals with trauma, working through creatively and artistically through the drama. It felt right to stage the play in 2017 in Turkish for the Turkish communities in London to acknowledge the situation in Turkey after the 2013 Gezi uprising and the 2016 coup d'etat attempt to question the current state of democracy. I will not show you a clip of that. There's also information on the internet for that. I just want to continue with the next. A theater artist from Turkey living now in Germany who plays with the in-betweeners in languages and cultures, but also who works through trauma is the Kurdish playwright Mirza Metin, who is also with us today. It's a pleasure and honor to talk about your work, but of course you could speak about it later, maybe yourself. For Metin, the new life in Germany came to cast a post-colonial understanding, retrospectively of his life in Turkey. Although exile was not on his mind when he came to Germany in 2018, because he was here just on an invitation by German theater director Frank Hoyle of Bonn's Fringe Ensemble, they hosted and supported him during his IFA Artist in Residence Fellowship to write a few plays, among which the Anziehungskräfte, Gravity, 2018, after which he co-produced with them other plays and founded the Kurdish-German theatre network Nexus and the German branch of Shermola Performance. It was only when he arrived in Germany that he sees his life as a double exile. The first time he was in exile was actually when he moved with his family from Kars to Istanbul at age 3, when he had to unlearn speaking Kurdish. And he sees today more clearly that not only is Eastern Turkey oppressed, the nationwide assimilation of Kurds and the under-appreciation of artists from the East in centers like Istanbul have historically brought the culture and the language of the Kurds under an existential threat. The recent play by Mirza, which he produced in Germany, reflecting his inner struggles with his colonized self in the Turkish language, working through communal trauma, so to speak, is I still cannot speak Kurmanca, I'm sorry. I say Ravastke Haraf, something like that, or Zwischenhalt, Ara Durak in Turkish, stopover in English. A collaboration between Shermola Performance Almanya and the Fringe Ensemble. In his performance, he presents three unnamed passengers, one Turkish, one Kurdish, one German, at a bench on an otherwise empty theater stage. They seem to be waiting for a bus that in some Beckettian way would never arrive, while there is talk of an upcoming storm. In the opening scene, maybe I should move to that next slide.
Mit der habe ich mich einmal getroffen und habe dann verschiedene Kontakte gehabt. Unter anderem ist mir Schermula Performance empfohlen worden als einziges kurdisches Theaterhaus.
Kimse kimseyi anlamıyor. Herkes kendi derdinde.
In the opening scene, one of the characters speaks of his urge to simply go away as the best option, to find a job, to stay low until the storm calms down and perhaps return, but maybe not. He also questions how to leave, since there actually everything he is there, wherever there is. Upon this suggestion to simply leave without being noticed, he then takes out a hand puppet, which you see there, from his pocket and starts a dialogue. This simple gesture of ventriloquism, externalizing the inner voice, Metin both creates and analyzes the myth of the storm, splitting the character into a dual perspective while trying to find consolation for the upcoming exile. I would like to then end with Alabora's 2020 adaptation of Nazım Hikmet's Memleketimden İnsan Manzaralar. So this was written by Hikmet several years after 1939, while serving a 13-year prison sentence due to his communist beliefs. It is a production that combines all the four functions, and it allows to discuss the issue of self-fashioning even more. Although Alabora did not want to make a performance about himself, Turkey or his exile, this production marks an important step in his coming to terms with his exilic situation in Wales. As he admits, quote, Nazim's poetry helped me to negotiate and translate my own perceptions of my pedigree. I started to see the pedigree because I had enough distance to it. Quote, end of quote. Reason to make the production was Alabora's lifelong fascination for Nazım Hikmet's poetry, as it usually comes out of a racket table. His friends, among others, Akim Olgun, who was in exile for 20 years, pushed him to do it. Through studying the lines while being in Wales and relearning the English language, Alabora was more and more seeing the language of Hikmet from a distance, digging into the mindset and words, noticing oddities in the Turkish language. Through Hikmet's language, he started then to peel off layers of exile, gradually finding an inevitable match, what he says, with the poet in exile. Quote, Nazim and I both come from a cultural elite. We were the hegemony, so to speak, but also dissidents and dangers. Of course, I can't compare to Hikmet, who is like a prophet, but his poetry could only be understood by being in exile and doing the play. Hikmet died in exile. I'm in exile, doing a show about a man who died in exile for people, most of whom have left their country. Some of them are in self-exile, because some of them are old migrants who came for political and economic reasons, and some of them would be of the new silent exodus. What happened then in my exilic mind was that I started to search for images, like for the Haydarpaşa station, with which the book starts, since the mind plays tricks with you in time. And then I wondered, how does he know? Since he is writing in prison, are people bringing him photos, or does he really remember everything by heart? I just realized that I didn't put the video on. If you like, we can watch it later, but I'm sorry for that, and I think it's also time to finish. But it was a very interesting play in the sense it was a very minimalist staging. In a black box situation, there was just 3 spotlights, and towards the end of the performance, a chalk painting of a man, who was who died probably, was made visible on the floor. So, and that's it. So it was just him with the words of Nazım Hikmet. Now, this minimalist staging allows for such interior reflections of the self and of the inner images in the mind, while giving a sense of being in a prison cell, going down in Nazım Hikmet's mind, so to speak, messing up our minds. The production demonstrates exactly the artistic urge for connection with history, with memory, to do some soul searching in the newly forming identity of the artists. The play, at the same time, also speaks to Turkish-speaking communities who have gone through similar experiences and whose memories have been equally fading. Exilic Life and the Exiled can give us, I think, a moment to pause and look at our own fragile state of life, existence, democracy, if you will, but also our own position in the world. Their theatres can offer us representations that are not merely reflections of a social reality beyond ourselves. They can be models for that reality, where the workings of aesthetics and performative affects aim to impact our debates of community, conviviality, social justice, peace, dignity, free speech, to name a few. They remind us of the larger realms of geopolitics, hegemony, imperialism, and power in the world. And even so, the precarious state of its interlocutors reveal to us the predicaments of a neoliberalism and the need for a solidarity, and I would even say an agonistic solidarity in Arendt's terms, a solidarity that is embodied and that moves us to do something. This may be the daily reality for the exiled artists who are constantly negotiating their exilic identities and subject positions through their works of art, also just by mere living, but in the end, it concerns all of us, including the very institutions and democracies who claim to be responsive. Thank you for your attention. Right, so any questions? I would say, I mean, we can discuss if you like, a few minutes, and if not, then we can continue with the panel. But I wanted to say this in advance as a kind of a closure of my research. And the next panel for me kind of follows naturally, since we have to talk about memory and especially how maybe institutions do not keep that memory and how we can organize the memory ourselves through independent forms of archives. But are there any questions, concerns, criticisms about what I just told you?
How many German artists were there? I mean, there was a dominance of the England.
Yeah, because when I wrote this text, I was actually doing my research in London. So there was more, and I thought also for the Berlin people it may be nice to see what's happening there, since I know that you know what's happening here. But I mean, I obviously, like your play, Ideal could be part of it. I should have put it on, of course. So I'm working on a book, basically. So this will be a larger platform for me to talk about all these different performances. So yeah. I mean, you are also trying to archive that, I know. So it's important that you do that. So yeah. Yeah, that's a follow-up project. I really wanted to look at the last 10 years because I'm also not a historian myself, but actually more and more I'm becoming one, I think, because I see the need for it. Of course, for the Turkish-German theater, Erol's work, Erol Baran's work is actually already quite substantive, so he actually made already the memory for the Turkish side, but for the Kurdish side there is none yet. So this is a longer project that we should endeavor together, maybe, or definitely you are working it already. So yeah, definitely. I know that there's a big lack there. Yeah. Thank you for your attention.